Good evening, everybody. This is Undead FOIA, and this is a show we've created recently called FOIA Around and Find Out. And for those that are unfamiliar with us, we're a group of Russiagate Sleuths, sort of amateur investigators that have really been following us over the last few years. We've submitted a number of FOIAs, obtained a number of documents, and also in the process of fighting for a number of documents. But we also do a fair amount of analysis on documents that might be declassified, and we do our best to try to understand it, and more recently to try to help others to understand it. So I'm joined tonight by my co-host MB. How are you doing tonight, MB?
I'm doing real good. I had a good weekend, had some good football, and ready to get back to work.
Yeah, you have a team still in the playoffs?
No, I'm kind of like just happy. I'm looking for good games. I don't have any horses in the race, so it's been a pretty good weekend. So looking for a good Super Bowl.
Good. All righty. Well, we had a good chat I think it was last night, MB, maybe the night before, on the DNC hack. So hopefully everybody enjoyed that. And we're obviously still setting this thing up. So looking to make some improvements over the next few weeks and try to spoof this up a little bit. But at the end of the day, this is all about getting information out there. It's not about production values. It's not about anything else. For us, it's just getting information out there. And tonight, we want to get some information out there on something that we've had for a while. I think I had a post on my Substack sort of about this. I had about half the email, and more recently I obtained the full email. So I obtained this from the Anders Paul, at the Anders Paul on Twitter, and I appreciate him sending this to me. I've had other pieces as well, but I don't think I ever had the full email until tonight. So I'm excited to show that, and I'm going to go ahead and jump into that if I can. Let me see here. Data mining, and there we go. So this is an email, and for those of you, hopefully you're somewhat familiar with what we've been discussing over the last year or so, in that Rodney Joffe and a few associated researchers were at the center of Alpha Bank allegations. And if you were familiar with the Michael Sussman trial or the indictment had outlined a much broader scheme in which some very suspicious, suspect kind of data, DNS lookups that were supposed or alleged to have represented a communications channel between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin were given to the FBI by Michael Sussman. But ultimately that had originated with Rodney Joffe and some of his associated researchers. And conclusions on that, really for anybody that's been independent, I'm not aware of anybody that's truly independent of those allegations that have given them any validity. The CIA concluded they were not technically plausible. The FBI debunked it, really shot it down within a couple of days. Independent researchers out there have called it fraud. Independent IT firms that have looked at it believe it's the work of a malicious actor. So that's a little bit of context. And then more recently, even last night on the chat that MB and I did, I mean, we've been finding out that the same group of researchers apparently had a prominent role in the attribution of the DNC hack. So that's obviously going to be a massive story once the media starts picking that up, because it's very clear that Manos Antonakakis and David Dagan of Georgia Tech had gone on after authoring the Alpha Bank white paper, and they were pulled in and worked for the Department of Justice and Special Counsel Mueller on a few different matters, including the DNC hack. So that's very alarming. But tonight we're gonna go off on a little bit of a tangent, and sort of the open question precipitating all this is going to be: is this something that's in John Durham's purview? Is he actually going to look at this, or is this going to be some type of spin-off investigation? And we can't answer that tonight. This looks like it's going to be set up to be a massive investigation, and it's not really, I wouldn't really say it's within the mandate of what John Durham was supposed to be looking at, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. So here we are. We have an email up on screen, and I'm going to upload this as a podcast, so I'm going to read off a fair amount of this, but it's an email from Kirk McConnell, who works on the Armed Services Committee in the United States Senate. And on this, he is sending this to a couple people from Microsoft. He's sending it to Manos Antonakakis. He is sending it to Rodney Joffe. And CC'd is Victor Opelman, also tagged with a packet forensics email address. And we know, and you might be unfamiliar with this, but Victor Opelman is a longtime business partner of Rodney Joffe. They're associated together with many different business entities. And so that's sort of the crux of where that comes in. So getting into the body of the email, and it's quite lengthy, but I really want to run this down and try to do this justice. So Kirk writes, Bill, Manos, Vic, it's Victor Opelman, and Rodney Joffe are performance on a DARPA program called Enhanced Attribution. We already knew that. That program is in the process of transitioning in prototype form to Cyber Command via support from SCO. That's an organization within the Department of Defense. Vic and Rodney's companies have access to commercial data that drives this capability. And in parentheses, he says DNS, flow records, active internet mapping capabilities, etc. Enhanced attribution is focused on tracking bad guys outside the DoD network perimeter. The military services, DISA, and Cyber Command are already collecting a range of similar or analogous metadata on network activity internal to DoD. And in parentheses, he goes on to say DNS, flow records, PCAP, log data, Active Directory, etc., and storing it for analysis under a program called the Big Data Platform. And then he goes on and he notes that this integration is being performed by a group of ex-NSA types at a company called Enlighten. And we might cover that in a future chat. Their software stack is based on OpenStack. And then he goes on, he says, the Big Data Platform instances are hosted on different cloud infrastructures. DISA's is on Milk Cloud, Army's and Cyber Command's on AWS, the other services on God knows what. And none of the instances are interoperable, can't be queried in a federated way, etc. Plus, the data sets are not consistent or remotely comprehensive across the different service and agency stovepipes. And then he says there are very few analytics running on top of all this data. The fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act mandates that the Department of Defense clean up this mess inside the Big Data Platform. Our provision is Section 1631, and we're gonna pull that up. But then he says, in our classified annex, we also direct Cyber Command to start architecture and program planning to support a major effort to gather cybersecurity pertinent metadata globally. The same data that DARPA is working with and has acquired from Vic, that's Victor Opelman, and Rodney, that's Rodney Joffe, in the Enhanced Attribution Program. With comprehensive internal and external metadata on network activity, Cyber Command would finally be in a position to create a COP/SA capability, and I think MB is going to weigh in on that, an ability to detect and identify intrusions and where they're coming from, identify adversary cyber infrastructure, and link what is observed inside DoD's perimeter to actions taking place external to DoD. This is a necessary foundation for planning and controlling offensive and defensive cyber operations. I'm going to skip the next paragraph, and then I'm going to pick up on the paragraph after that. So it's ultimately, in my opinion, it would make sense to put the BDPs, which is big data platforms, on a commercial cloud, Azure or AWS, that's Microsoft product or Amazon, and augment the internal DoD metadata in the BDPs with global metadata. But the next step is to develop advanced analytic algorithms to operate on that massive data set. That's pretty interesting. So keep in mind, I'm going to pause right here. All this is relating to Rodney Joffe, who we've learned over the last year is at the center of these Alpha Bank allegations. We also have recently, we have an allegation that Rodney Joffe played an integral role in tracing the hack of the DNC back to Russia. So that's pretty alarming that he would be subject to both of those. But here we're finding out, in reality, he has extensive ties to the U.S. government, and we've really known that. But to see it in writing is pretty alarming. I mean, we have a representative of the Senate who's detailing this program, and he's saying, you know, in a classified annex, they are starting a massive data collection program. So that's pretty alarming, right? So it's right here. I'm going to highlight that. Oops. Now, if you're like a First Amendment guy, if you're a libertarian, you might have some questions on that, right? Is this directed at foreign adversaries? Is this being used domestically? And we can say, based on documents that we have obtained, there are times domestic investigations are coming down from the Department of Justice and the FBI, and they're going to DARPA for cyber-related inquiries. Now, I don't know specifically which programs within DARPA are being used in that manner, but I would say broadly speaking, it's a concern of what they're doing domestically and how our current laws might apply. Because in all the emails that I have, I don't ever see them talking about the Fourth Amendment. I don't see them talking about warrants. I don't see any of that. And for those that are a little bit unfamiliar with what the Enhanced Attribution Program is within DARPA, that's a program in which they're taking massive amounts of data, and then based on behavioral patterns, they're able to essentially identify who that person is. So even if the initial data is anonymous, within their capability and within their intention of the program, they're using that to identify who you are. So the idea that they're taking in all this data and a global metadata collection program is somewhat alarming. And then the other alarming part was up here where it says Victor and Rodney's companies have access to commercial data, which drives this capability. I mean, how many questions would that spurn? What type of commercial data and what type of terms of use? I mean, what do the customers know about this data and their data that's being used in this manner? I think there's a lot of questions that would originate just from that. I do want to continue and highlight a few other things. Scrolling down here, it says DARPA had a program called Net Defense run by I2O that's within DARPA under Dr. Randy Garrett, which I continue under the name Chase, which I gather continued under the name Chase under Jen Roberts. The program was aimed at building algorithms to detect advanced adversary intrusions by analyzing metadata like that collected within the Big Data Platform program. Note that these efforts are directed at analyzing metadata inside the DoD's perimeter. This program spawned two companies, Keith Alexander's IronNet. Now, if you're unfamiliar, Keith Alexander is former head of the NSA within the Obama administration. So we're not talking about like just some guy. If you read this a couple times, you realize this program spawned two companies. Well, what does that mean? That means the Department of Defense had a need for to place services outside their official structure. So they spawned a couple companies. They spun off a couple companies to handle operations. And the first concern with that would be, are they trying to do an end around our laws? Are they trying to get this outside of the government's control on paper? But are they effectively in control of these companies? Are they doing something unlawful that they shouldn't be doing? And then he goes on to say, and a company called Cybraics, which is now partnered with Microsoft Azure. Cybraics boasts several dozen AI ML algorithms. DoD has not seen fit to buy or use any commercial analytics like those that come out of DARPA or industry. And it goes on. It goes on to talk about Enlighten a little bit more, sort of this partnership that's out there. And so that's the first part that I want to cover. But then there's a larger story that this plugs into. So the takeaways from this are Victor Appelman and Rodney Joffe's companies are providing commercial data, and there is this global collection of metadata that's going on. So that's pretty alarming in and of itself. But switching over, let me see. There we go. So this is section 1631 of the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. So this is the section that was referenced by Kirk McConnell. And this is talking about, and I don't know specifically which section of this, within this paragraph that he's really referencing, but what he's talking about, what most of the section relates to is clandestine military operations in the information environment as traditional military activities. A clandestine military operation in information environment shall be considered a traditional military activity for the purposes of, National Security Act. Okay, let's scroll through this a little bit more. So is there anything else in this section? Talking about structure within the Department of Defense, that's fine. Just scrolling through this here. Let's see, is there anything else interesting? Scroll through a little bit more. Notification requirements for sensitive military cyber operations. Bunch of mumbo jumbo. Let's see here. So written notification by inserting designee. Essentially, if things go really bad, you got to disclose it. That was my gist of what they had written there. That's really it. They're talking about clandestine military operations using this authority. So I'm going to switch over to the broader context I want to get to. Stop screen. I'm going to reshare here. Bear with me. All right. So if you've been following this really, really closely, you will have known about what I'm about to share. Oh boy, let me see here. Let me see if I get this right. Nope. Apologies. Here we go. All right. So this was a story that came out recently. I'm actually going to flip over to, oops, here we go. Wall Street Journal. So Wall Street Journal printed this in April, and this relates to a company called Measurement Systems. And Measurement Systems is a company that is associated with Rodney Joffe. It's also a company that is registered in Panama, which is a known money laundering hub. Not a lot of really good reasons to do business there, but it certainly puts you out of reach of typical investigations. I mean, you're not going to get a whole lot of records out of a company that's registered in Panama. So that's sort of the benefit of doing business there. But they talk about this company called Measurement Systems, which through a series of corporate records is essentially linked to the same ownership as Packet Forensics. So this is a company associated with Rodney Joffe. And what they're talking about is a software element that surreptitiously harvests data. And Google had pulled a bunch of apps that were in the Google store that had this malicious code. But they go on to describe this. So the code ran on millions of Android devices, and it's been found inside several Muslim prayer apps that have been downloaded more than 10 million times, as well as a highway speed trap detection app, QR reading code app, and a number of other popular consumer apps, according to two researchers who discovered the behavior of this code. So it goes on in another paragraph. Measurement Systems paid developers around the world to incorporate its code, known as a software development kit, or SDK. Remember, that's going to be important, a software development kit, into their apps. And yeah, I think that's the gist of what I want to cover on that one. But then let's switch over to TrustCore. Yeah, here we go. So this was a little bit more recent. So this relates to TrustCore, which is a root certificate authority. And essentially, this is going to be providing certifications to a bunch of different websites that they are secure. And what they found on this one was, essentially they also have this messaging system. And within that, this company was basically gaining access to users' communications. And then they were providing that information to the U.S. government. So that's pretty alarming. Obviously, they say TrustCore's Panamanian registration records. This is another company registered in Panama. Showed the same slate of officers, agents, and partners as Spyware maker identified last year as an affiliate of Arizona-based Packet Forensics. That's Rodney Joffe's company. And one of those contracts listed the place of performance as Fort Meade, the home of the National Security Agency and the Pentagon's Cyber Command. So that's pretty alarming, right? And we're going to get into a broader theory and a broader context, but this is really important right here, okay? One of the contracts listed the place of performance as Fort Meade, the home of the National Security Agency and the Pentagon's Cyber Command. So keep that in mind, because what I did is I went over to Open Corporates because sort of another tie-in is that registering these companies these companies are registered out of two holding companies. And the first holding company is called Chivalric Holding Company, and the other is Frigate Bay Holdings. And these companies are registered in St. Kitts and Nevis. And this is another well-known money laundering hub, but it's also a good place to just hide your corporate records, right? You're not going to get a whole lot of visibility into that. So they registered these companies, and these are affiliated with a gentleman named Raymond Salino, who's also tied to Packet Forensics and longtime business partner Rodney Joffe through many different entities. So Frigate Bay Holdings and Chivalric Holding Company are both registered in St. Kitts and Nevis. So that's sort of a red flag. But then they took these companies and they used these companies to go ahead and register TrustCore Measurement Systems and a company called Atmospheric in Panama. So there's 3 companies that register in Panama using companies registered in St. Kitts and Nevis. So that's pretty alarming. You wouldn't expect that. And so talking about Atmospheric, the website's been taken offline, but there is a copy. Here we go. So what they offer is app development. Hey, how about that? Because also we know there's 2 companies that have surreptitiously been harvesting data, and they have a malicious code, an SDK. And now on a 3rd company, they have app development. So isn't that interesting? And cyber researchers that I've been talking to recently theorize that this 3rd company and the applications that they've been designing serve as a means for measurement systems or for measurement systems to implant that malicious SDK into their code, and then they can harvest much more data. And there might be a few other companies that are also provide application development services, but that's sort of the working theory, is that this 3rd company might actually serve as a means through which they can upload that malicious SDK and harvest more and more data. And then you have to start thinking about why, right? Like, who is Rodney Joffe? And we can see he's got extensive ties to the U.S. intelligence community. But when you go back and you revisit these articles a little bit, they're talking about the development of, largely related to Muslim prayer apps. Some of these others, they describe them as popular consumer apps. I don't really know exactly which ones those refer to, but if these seem to be targeted outside the United States, well, which government agencies might be interested in data from those users? And you start to center on organizations maybe like the CIA or certainly some other intelligence agencies. But this really seems to start fitting together into a scheme whereby, Rodney Joffe is providing commercial data to the U.S. government. And if you didn't have this other context, what you might do is you might conclude, oh, well, he's got Packet Forensics, which deploys a bunch of internet sensors. Maybe he's got a couple other companies. But is this all plugged into that scheme as well? Is this part of the commercial data that are providing to the Department of Defense under the same programs? Or does this plug in somewhere else? Is there another government agency where this data is being sold to? And that's an open question, right? We don't have enough information. We don't have the visibility into those agencies to be able to tell you one way or the other. But it's time to get this in the public conversation. I think, whether John Durham actually looks at this, and I got to say, I don't think John Durham would get into this because this doesn't directly relate to the 2016 election. Within his mandate and the order assigning his, or detailing his presence, this isn't related to the 2016 election. It isn't related to anything that happened to either the campaigns or even the Trump administration. This is well outside that. So this would seem to be a spin-off investigation, if anything. But really, Congress has got to, I think Congress really should probably take a look at this because they sort of set this in motion, right? Because all of a sudden we have the 2020 NDAA where they're talking about the big data platform and some of these authorizations. And we just have a lot of questions. And I'm going to take a break. And MB, I don't know if you want to jump in with some of your thoughts. I'd be happy to hear what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did see this. I wish I had the link, but there's a website, and I'll find it and I'll post it. But somebody was on top of this measurement systems issue, and a lot of people were at one point. Google App Store, I think, banned a lot of the apps that were using that SDK. But if to kind of give an explanation for what all this means is, if you're building an app, you're not coding it up from the ground up. You're going to use a software development kit to create shortcuts so you can build the app out much more easily. So these guys are implanting spyware into it, and the way that these particular ones worked was it was bypassing either your phone or a router security and making it reveal its MAC address or an IP address potentially. Basically, it was to kill your anonymity. So even if you were using some kind of means of disguising your IP address, like a lot of people do, this would bypass that by just broadcasting out to a specific website and collecting the information of what the actual MAC number of the device is, what the the fingerprint of your phone, your router, whatever it is. So that is it's not unlike what Edward Snowden revealed as far as the CIA hacking tools that got out into the wild that he brought to light. This is sort of these aren't it's spyware in a sense, but this is stuff that we worry about all the time because people put stuff like this into their apps and things for less nefarious reasons, for just getting data to advertise mostly, and that's not what this is. That doesn't make any sense as far as this is just oh great, we can have more audience information and be able to sell more products to them. This doesn't seem like that at all. And the fact that it goes right back to packet forensics and these same companies that are in cahoots with the NSA, and this all ties together pretty neatly. It's there's really no doubt that these guys are it's a method of spying, and it's not exclusive by any means. This is not foreign spying. This is in the Google App Store. It's probably predominantly going to be domestic stuff, and if they're going after Muslim prayer apps, obviously this is some legacy of the war on terror of we want to see who particular Muslims are and what apps they're using, and develop data about them, which is disturbing. Those are Americans potentially. So yeah, this is some pretty serious stuff as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and then they talk about the different types of data, and DNS, flow records, PCAP, log data. I don't know what half that means, but it sounds like a fairly intrusive amount of spying, because one of the other things we should circle back to is in their capacity as a certificate authority and through the different technology that Packet Forensics owns, they can actually see a lot more, because some of the surveillance equipment that Packet Forensics provides to the U.S. government, in concert with them being a certificate authority, they can capture usernames, they can capture passwords. And it's very, very alarming that there's this sort of public-private partnership, and it makes you ask so many questions, because what if one of the byproducts of what Edward Snowden did was that they just started outsourcing this, and they put it on paper outside the reach of the U.S. government, but in reality, I mean, you've got companies that are being started by the former head of the NSA and some of these other individuals that are so closely tied and so dependent on being awarded these federal contracts, and without them, they don't exist as business entities. It's like, yeah, okay, the government's not doing it anymore, but all of a sudden, they're still doing it. They're still in control of these private companies, quote unquote. I mean, it's really hard to classify them as typical companies. They're really just arms of the U.S. government. The government effectively owns these companies, and they're using them to collect this data. And then, you start asking more and more questions, like, why would they have these other corporate registrations? I mean, what are they really trying to hide by registering in St. Kitts, by registering in Panama? Are they trying to evade U.S. laws? I mean, if they were based in the United States, and they still are, but on paper, if they're based outside of the country, are they able to evade some of our laws in what they're doing, and that's another alarming question. So, Kingmaker, I see you popped in. I don't know if you want to come back and share some of your ideas from a legal perspective, but if we'll see if he wants to pop in. But yeah, MB, I don't know if you have any thoughts on like the types of data or some of the stuff. And one of the other things I wanted to ask Kingmaker if he comes back in is it's sort of about FISA, because a lot of this in the wake of Edward Snowden, it was all about getting FISA warrants if you wanted to collect data on U.S. citizens. But all of a sudden, you put this under a private company, and they can just harvest this data at will, and then they can, provide this to the U.S. government because it's within maybe their terms of use, or maybe it's not. I don't know. But then you just evade it, right? You can just do an end around all the legal requirements of our entire legal system, and you can spy on whoever you want to spy on. And it's very alarming to see this, and just in context, right? Just in context of the AlphaMake allegations, the DNC hack that we have so many questions about, and so many unanswered questions as it relates to Rodney Joffe and Manos and Tanakakis, and some as yet to be fully explained role in attribution for the DNC hack and helping Special Counsel Mueller. And now all of a sudden we see the same individuals, they're deeply tied to U.S. intelligence community. So, I mean, that's really what I wanted to highlight tonight. I think that's important. But if you have any thoughts, MB?
Yeah, the going back to the initial DARPA email. From what I'm reading of that, most of it looks like DNS. It's packet capture, basically mapping the internet, and a lot of stuff's going on. It looks like what they're talking about is Department of Defense has their own internal intranet of DoD, which is huge in its own right. And they have all kinds of different platforms, and they're trying to integrate all that into this big platform, but they're also trying to, at the same time, bring in external information that is sort of the Joffe packet forensics, New Star kind of stuff that is huge amounts of data that they want to integrate. And one thing to remember is back in very beginning of 2021, when the DoD sold those 175 million IP addresses that they were squatting on, and the company that bought them was owned or had as a chief officer Ray Salino, who we were just FOIA was just talking about. That all plays into this. That's I would say definitely part of this whole framework that they're using those. They were speculated to be sort of a honeypot for if you get people to connect with these IP addresses, you can do a lot of things to figure out who is doing that, and you sort of get the architecture of all that together. And I think through some sophisticated algorithms and maybe some AI, it's probably the hope. You can find out a lot about sort of mapping the entire internet, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's probably what the DoD should be doing, but there should be some serious questions asked about where does that turn into domestic spying? Where does that, obviously, if you're doing something global, that includes the United States. So, and what, if this stuff is all above board and all legal, well and good, but somebody needs to ask that question, and who these people that they're dealing with, are they above board? That's another question.
Absolutely. Kingmaker, I saw you popped in. I don't know if you want to comment from a legal perspective or anything else. We'd have to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I have some comments. To start with, let's begin with FISA. FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which means it applies to foreign intelligence, and it applies to surveillance of electronic communications among people who are not U.S. citizens, but who communicate electronically outside of the U.S., or who communicate with each other, where one is in the U.S. and one is outside the U.S. It's not supposed to be used at all to capture communications by or among U.S. citizens, even if they're abroad. So, and it was tightened up after the Snowden disclosures of what they had been up to, how broad their surveillance activity, the government's surveillance of U.S. citizens had gotten. So Congress tried to tighten that up with amendments to the FISA Act and thought they had corralled it. What you're describing, FOIA, sounds like, first of all, a government agency outsourcing intelligence gathering. We don't know that for sure because we haven't seen the actual intelligence that they are gathering. But just take one of the words you used in your description of what they capture, metadata. Doesn't metadata include actual underlying metadata that would permit someone to understand what was communicated by text or by email?
It wouldn't necessarily be the content of a message, but I think the argument is that the metadata of it in and of itself could tell you a lot of things. Let's say if someone was going to a website about skin cancer, that would tell you that this person has an interest in skin cancer. It doesn't tell you what they looked at necessarily, or if they send an email to it, that's not the content of what it is, but it tells you a lot. And if you have a lot of that, you can aggregate it all and it can actually give you some really actionable information.
I have seen metadata that would let someone actually determine what was being communicated. Now, maybe that was some specialized program, but I know it because I've seen it with my eyes. It certain communications can lead to metadata that would permit someone to translate effectively what was communicated, the substance. But even if this doesn't do that, and like I said, we don't know until we see it.
Well, just to jump in, there are techniques to grab potentially logins, passwords, and things that would then let you have whatever you wanted. And that's something that, that's old hacker technique kind of stuff. But I think that's definitely on the table of what we're talking about here.
Right.
The purpose of FISA is to regulate just how far the intelligence agencies can go in gathering foreign intelligence without stepping on to the rights of privacy of U.S. citizens and their Fourth Amendment rights. Because whereas the government can capture text, emails, and all kinds, any other kind of communication you can imagine overseas, they can't get that from American citizens in the U.S. without either a court order or a warrant, a search warrant. And this has all the earmarks of an end around because it's certainly capturing like logins, telephone calls, or cell phone calls, dates and times of text communication, whether or not you can read the content or not. You can know who's communicating with whom. That's something the government cannot get from an American citizen without getting a court order. Doesn't have to have probable cause, but in most cases, but does require a court order. So,
King, let me
but
ask you a hypothetical question here. So let's say we're talking about Facebook. Now, if Facebook is doing some internal monitoring and they come across some alarming information, or maybe they run some analytics and they decide they want to alert the US government, they're free to do that. And the government can take that information and use it. And I think everybody agrees that's probably fine. That's probably, we have some expectations of privacy on platforms that are probably misplaced, but on a Facebook or a company like that, really they have the full control. They have the full capability and authorization to go ahead and do that, and that's fine. But if it's really the government that is founding these companies through the creation of programs and the awarding of contracts to form companies to service them, and they're going and they're doing an end around, just like you said, they're implanting malicious code and they're acting for the benefit really of an intelligence service of the US government. I think there's a red line that's been crossed. I mean, just because it's on paper, it's a private company, it's not the same as what we refer to it with Facebook. It's the US government is really using this as an end around our Fourth Amendment protections.
well, you recall in 2016, the chief judge of the FISA court issued a report that it was not proper for the NSA and the FBI to use contractors to gather the data, the electronic communication data that they were basically monitoring for all foreigners looking for threats. But in the process, U.S. Citizens would be caught up in that net, and to make things worse, these contractors were running searches on the database, looking for communications from identified U.S. persons, to or from U.S. persons. The FISA court made it clear that although this was a third-party contractor doing it, they were doing it under the imprimatur of the FBI as a contractor to the FBI, basically as the FBI's agent, and they ordered that it be stopped. This sounds like they're trying to skirt around that rule.
Yeah, and that also sort of happened at the same time that we're seeing a lot of this stuff develop. I'm sure it's related. We the FISA stuff is fascinating, and the NSA, the contractor stuff will never end, because at some point, I forget the year, but relatively recently, the NSA decided we are going to stop collecting all this data ourselves, and we will just rely on the basically the internet companies to warehouse this stuff, and then we'll go get it from them when we need it, or the FBI can if they do. So that's sort of just where things stand. There's just too much data, and they would just end up building data farm upon data farm, and they don't want to do it. And why should they, when they can, if the internet service providers are just acting as sort of public-private partnership, like some of these other companies we're talking about, then they're just acting on behalf of the government. They don't need to have this infrastructure. And it also gives them the advantage of, well, we have people that are not government employees that maybe can do things that government employees are not allowed to do, or there would be records of them doing. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. And I don't think we have a very good picture of just how widespread that is. We think about AT&T or Verizon as, these working on behalf of the government, but that's, Packet Forensics is not a big company. It's a small company, and they're doing some crazy stuff apparently that could be on behalf of the government, could be on behalf of some three-letter agencies. We know Rodney Joffe has his security clearances via the NSA. We have documentation on that. I don't know what role he plays with them, if any, at this point, but these guys are all very much in bed with the government. And if they're, out there putting out spyware, I think that's something that needs to be investigated immediately. And I think the public needs to know what's going on.
Exactly. It sounds like it's not only end around the laws, but it's an end around primarily to avoid all oversight. That kind of structure eliminates the ability of the FISA court to have any oversight. It eliminates the ability of any government auditor to have any effective oversight, and Congress. Congress would be where I would go first because they have subpoena power outside the government to maybe subpoena these companies or their owners, but they're creating a black box, basically, an intelligence gathering black box that is impossible to oversee by legitimate public authorities.
The FISA court can't even keep track of the FBI. How are they going to keep track of all these other companies? It's just not going to happen.
One of the other things I wanted to call out is it's not just the data provision. The ties that Rodney Joffe has throughout our government are massive. I think they're far greater than we're even talking about right now, because in addition to the provision of data and the collection of data, we also know that Joffe does a fair amount of the analytics. So we talk about the analytics that were going on over top of all this data on this program and certainly other programs within DARPA and intelligence agencies. But here we get some indication that Joffe and Newstar, for that matter, which was the longtime employer of Rodney Joffe, they actually do a fair amount of the analytics on this data as well. So I have a pretty interesting email here, and it gets more and more interesting as I scroll through this. But this is Lisa Hook. So she was the CEO of Newstar. And the Michael that she is referencing here is Michael Sussman, who was the longtime outside counsel for Newstar, who, of course, would later be, he's also the lawyer for the DNC and the Clinton campaign during the 2016 election. He's the one that brought the Alpha Bank data to the FBI. But here we're talking about analytics. So she says, Michael's our longtime outside counsel on national security and other issues. He's worked with Rodney, that's Rodney Joffe, on a proposal to provide analytics similar to what you're doing in Australia. So that's pretty alarming. So in Australia, apparently Newstar also has a data program. They run some analytics, and I actually got some color on this through some other research that I was doing, and that's pretty alarming. So there's another federal, there's a government that is relying on some of what Rodney Joffe is doing. But I want to keep going through this. So Rodney is closed off right now. Michael needs someone to speak to for more details on the service so we can provide a proposal. And this is where it starts getting weird. So Miles Antonakakis says, hey, Lisa just boarded a flight. Can't talk to you. Michael, nice to meet you. Let's connect later. But to be totally honest, I would like to clarify what the request here is as a first step. This is not technology that is related to Newstar beyond the fact that we use your data. Could Newstar offer something similar? Sure, since you have the data here. However, what Georgia Tech is doing, the technology we are generating, is for the U.S. government, the DoD, the Department of Defense, to be precise. So that's pretty interesting. Scrolling through this, Joffe says, yada, yada. And here's Michael Sussman. So he says, Manos, Rodney is helping me to prepare a proposal and description of the commercial services that you plan to offer in July or thereafter. And this is an email in April 2018. Rodney's tied up today, but he has time this evening. So he's just trying to get a meeting with Manos and Antonakakis. But commercial services is interesting because Manos is a researcher at Georgia Tech. But as we have learned through other research, he also has a couple companies himself. So This is where it gets weird because whatever they start talking about here, there's something that's gone wrong. And Manos from his Georgia Tech email account says, "I am sorry, Michael, but I have no idea what you are talking about. Perhaps a call is in order." And Rodney Joffe seems to sense that something has gone dramatically off the rails. There's something here that's gone wrong that was not supposed to go to his Georgia Tech account. So Joffe says, "Guys, you're talking at cross purposes. Manos, what time do you land? I will make sure I get out of my meeting and talk by phone. Michael, please stand down now." So it's going to get more and more weird. Manos says, "I land at 2 o'clock. I'm on a telephone call with Jason Livengood of Comcast. And by then, I should be walking in a DARPA building." So this is going to be another thread to pull. Comcast and Cox are mentioned through some other emails that I have. So one of the questions that I've had is to what extent they might be providing any data to the U.S. government. But then we go on. It says, Joffe says, "After you're done, it's fine. Michael, when Miles calls, I'll add you to the call." And here's a CYA email, okay? This is very, very strange because these guys all know each other, right? This is not like a new relationship. They all know each other by this point. And Manos Tanakakis says, "Cool. For the record, let me remind everybody that Georgia Tech is Newstar's customer with respect to enhanced attribution and very soon Hawks programs. Those are programs at DARPA. This means we are buying your data so we can conduct research and validate our algorithms. It's only fair to assume that if we find malice in your data, we have an ethical responsibility to report it to you." That's a very, very weird statement to make. He knows these guys. This is a CYA statement. So whatever is going on here was not supposed to be in his Georgia Tech account. It was not supposed to be subject to the Open Records Act. And here we go. So Rodney Joffe says, "Manos, calm down, take deep breaths. Lisa and Michael jumped the gun without telling me what they were planning before I could discuss it with you. I understand the situation. This is Lisa confusing Nodos," that's one of Manos's companies, "and Georgia Tech in your dual role, which you should have expected. Let's talk when you get done with DARPA." And then Manos says, "If you see this in the next 5 minutes, call me." So very, very weird email. But I really brought that up solely to highlight the analytics, but in effort to be fully provide all the context. It is a very, very weird email, generally speaking. So all that to say, Rodney Joffe, he's not just involved in the data provision; he's involved in the analytics too. And this is another point for hopefully the Republican Congress to look at. I mean, all of a sudden, this guy is involved in the AlphaBank allegations. He's involved in the investigation of the DNC hack. He's got close ties to Michael Sussman, who's the point man for the DNC, running point with CrowdStrike and everything that was going on with the hack. And they have just these massive relationships to U.S. intelligence and governments of other nations. And it just offers up so many questions. So MB or King, if you guys want to jump in, have to hear your thoughts.
Well, I got a very good explanation for that, why that email seems so weird. And it is a total CYA move. It seems to me that so Manos, Dagan, all these guys, and so is Rodney Joffe. They all have these side companies that are involved in all this in one respect or another. And I am positive that the thing that keeps Manos or any of these guys up at night is that there's any possibility that Georgia Tech will say, "Hey, wait a minute, are you using our work product or our intellectual property in your own private company to make money? Because we're going to sue you." And that's that's their golden parachute, is that these companies end up, that's how Rodney Joffe became very wealthy. He's got all these, he makes all these companies, and he, some of them are successful, some of them aren't, but the ones that are, you could be a very, very wealthy person. So I would guess that is a very clear, I'm going to put this on paper that, my side company has nothing to do with what I'm doing at Georgia Tech. Don't ask me anything about that. I don't know what you're talking about. That's the way I read that.
And I agree, and I would add that to have any of these side companies be connected on paper to a government entity like Georgia Tech, or government associated entity like Georgia Tech or DARPA, would defeat the purpose. Suddenly, all of their records and everything they're up to would be subject to FOIA. So, FOIA, you are fully aware of the games that can be played and are being played on that.
Yes.
But it also allows them, each of these guys, to basically leverage their access to government data and government computer programs to make a killing outside in the private world. It's a neat job if you can find it. All of the capital and research and development is being bought and paid for with taxpayer dollars, and then they're taking it on the side and using it to make tons of money, operate an intelligence gathering black box, so to speak, at the direction of the government, but without any oversight. It's as bad as you can get.
Absolutely. And that's really why I wanted to do this tonight, and why I think this might be the biggest story that we have broken, because Alpha Bank stuff's bad. Some of the documents we've gotten on the DNC hack and the involvement of Georgia Tech and some of that other stuff is really interesting, but this is ongoing. I mean, all these companies that we're talking about, and a bunch of other companies we haven't mentioned tonight, they're still under contract. They're still getting paid. They're still in operation. And, this stuff is very much ongoing. So it's very alarming. And we have this long history, that's starting to form where, the mere disclosure and the confirmation, the public confirmation of the existence of some of the stuff isn't enough to stop it. I mean, just because, all these people were identified in public reporting and, they don't look so good, that doesn't stop anything. I mean, whether it's Igor Danchenko as, a confidential human source, in the wake of the IG Horowitz report being continued as confidential human source, or any of these other stuff, Packet Forensics, I'm as far as I'm aware, they're still, all their contracts are still getting paid. Microsoft's involvement, there's a pretty interesting thread from Stephen McIntyre, I think, from a couple of months ago that I'd like to revisit. But all this stuff is still very much in play. So that's really, the extent of this. I mean, this is one email, guys. Like, there's so many different questions to be asked here, and as bad as this email is, and I'm betting tonight that Kirk McConnell really regrets sending this. This seems like a lot of information to send to a public email address, but as bad as this is, I'm betting there's a lot more. And I'm betting Rodney Joffe has involvement in a lot more. And that's really what I would hope, a Republican Congress member is sitting there listening to us right now. And they're going to say, hey, we got to send some subpoenas, right? We got to look at how we can stop funding all this stuff through DARPA and through the Department of Defense, and really get into the Department of Defense, because that's the nefarious part for me. One of the points for me is that all this is in the Department of Defense, which, their budget goes up every single year. Nobody wants to cut the defense budget, and you're shielded from scrutiny to a much greater extent, because a lot of the members of Congress, members of the Senate, they don't want to get in there, and they don't really have the access. There's a lot of reluctance to really get in there and do these investigations. But as we mentioned, some of this is domestic. Like, we know that because we have emails coming down from the Department of Justice and the FBI tasking DARPA, and in turn, DARPA tasking Milos Antonakakis to look at, like, the Tree of Life synagogue shooter and his online history. So this is definitely happening domestically, and getting the full picture of, whose data is being collected, who's being analyzed and mined, and what the nature of all this is crucial. I mean, that's something we just have to have full awareness of. And And I'm surprised there's not a bigger sensitivity to stuff like this in the wake of, Snowden and everything that Snowden identified. I don't think it's better. If anything, I think a lot of this is worse. And to the extent that these public-private partnerships have formed and they're being pushed out there, at the end of the day, it might just be, more shielded from scrutiny than it was when it was inside the government. Because now you have to go subpoena private companies, and there's all these different considerations. And it might even be harder to uncover some of this. So
yeah, and to the contrary, I think we just saw the link that Georgia Tech is receiving an additional $65 million contract with DARPA to build a couple of new research centers. So, I mean, this stuff is expanding, if anything.
it absolutely is. Yeah, that's a great point, MB. As we said, this stuff is continuing, and more contracts are being awarded to these entities, and that's extremely disturbing, especially when you circle back to like the AlphaBank allegations, which apparently involved a contract that was awarded to Georgia Tech and data that was purchased from Newstar, and there hasn't been accountability for that. They abused their customers' trust to sell that data, to mine that data for dirt on Donald Trump and Trump campaign associates. And there's fundamental question of compliance and what compliance is going to look like on these federal contracts. And data privacy. MB, you and I think every time we step on a chat, we talk about a data privacy law. Everybody in this country presumes, to some extent, they have a presumption that there's some privacy there, and it's certainly not the case. I don't think I have anything else, guys, but King or MB, if you guys have a final thought, go ahead.
Well, just real quick, I think that this is, if anything, just another pile of breadcrumbs that we need to run down. There's some interesting new entities and names that are tied together with all this that we're going to get to the bottom of. And, I hope that Congress looks at. I hope that some actual professional investigators get at, because, we're figuring this stuff out. It's not, hey, FOIA is brilliant. There's some really clever investigators, but we don't have anything like the power of a prosecutor or the FBI to go and get records and put people, under oath or in front of a grand jury and really find out some things. So there's obviously much more out there. And I guess my biggest fear is that they know all this and they don't care, that they're happy that packet forensics is out running around doing things like this, and that these entities are seeding spyware all over the place. I hope that's not true. I hope that this is sort of an off the books kind of thing that's happening, and maybe we can track down the wrongdoers, and this isn't something that Congress is just like, yeah, fine, go for it. That's what we're paying for. That could be the case, but I think the country needs to know one way or the other. People really got to think about this stuff, because this is real privacy. This is real, it's expanding so fast that it's hard to keep track of. And I think something's going to be done of it. It's going to be too late.
I would add that DARPA is clearly already on the Republican House's radar for their involvement in the gain of function and other research into viruses around the world that they funded or tried to fund. And this is just another episode in all of this defense earmarked money going into basically a black hole with little or no oversight by either the executive branch or Congress. So somebody needs to wake up.
Absolutely. And Jeb had a good question. So can Jim Jordan subpoena all the bank accounts to see what the companies are being paid or cash flows? Yeah, I mean, that would be a great thing, because end of the day, like John Durham's report, like I said before, like I don't know that he's getting into all of this. This might be like a spinoff investigation, but if there's no indictment, we're never really going to get the full story on some of this stuff. So especially for this data collection program and all this, this would be great for the Republican Congress to start looking at. Send out a lot of subpoenas. I think looking at bank accounts would be fantastic, especially when you're talking about the Panamanian companies and the holding companies that are registered in St. Kitts. That's just a big red flag. Those are money laundering hubs. I'm not saying there's money laundering, but there is something very, very wrong that we need to get to the bottom of. So bank records would be a great idea. Some of the contracts, a lot of that information is actually a little bit more publicly available. But to the extent that any contracts are not really publicly known out there, I mean, we need some subpoenas. We need some people to, be called in to testify and really disclose the full nature of the data that's being provided to the U.S. government, where that data is being provided, and where it's coming from. And certainly to the extent that there's any cash flows and some of those things, I think that'd be a great thing to look at too. There is more. There's another side of the story. There's, for various reasons, I don't want to go into it right now. Sort of working some things out with some people and sort of going through some stuff, and kind of want to keep a few cards in the pocket still. So I'm not going to disclose everything that I have, but this is obviously like a big piece, right? This is a big, in my opinion, this is a big problem. This is a big story, and it deserves the attention of a Republican Congress. And hopefully they're listening tonight, and hopefully they're going to be on this tomorrow morning. And with that, I don't think I have anything else, guys. I really appreciate MB, King. I love hearing from you guys every time you come in. Appreciate you coming in tonight, and I'm going to end this one here.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you and good night.